The house was quiet in the way only late evenings ever were. Not peaceful, just suspended. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic beyond the windows, the soft tick of the wall clock that Daniel Crow had meaning to replace for years and never did. He was sitting at the kitchen table, laptop open but untouched, notes from an unfinished article glowing faintly on the screen. A city council corruption piece. Routine work, safe work, the kind of story that made noise but never followed him home. His daughter stood in the doorway. Mara didn't speak at first. She never did when something was wrong. She just stood there, fingers curled into the hem of her long-sleeve shirt, eyes fixed on the floor as if the tiles might give her permission to talk. Daniel noticed immediately. Journalists notice pauses, silences, even the places where sound should be. "What's going on, kiddo?" he asked gently. She took 2 steps forward, stopped. Her voice was barely above a breath. "Daddy, don't react, just look. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe the channel and let me know in the comments where are you watching from. It helps more than you know." She lifted her sleeve. Daniel didn't move, not because he didn't understand, but because he did. Bruises bloomed along her ankle and calf, fingerprints dark and unmistakable even to an untrained eye. Some yellowed at the edges, others newer, layered, repeated. His throat tightened, but he kept his face still. Mara was watching him closely, searching for the thing she feared most. Reaction. "Does it hurt right now?" he asked. She nodded once. "Okay," Daniel said, forcing calm into his voice. Thank you for telling me." That was when she cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent tears slipping down her cheeks, her body folding inward as if she'd been holding herself upright by sheer will alone. He pulled her into his chest and held her there, careful not to touch her leg. Later, much later, when she was asleep in his bed with the hallway light on, Daniel sat alone again. This time, the laptop wasn't blank. He photographed the bruises carefully, clinically. He documented angles, coloration, spacing. He wrote timestamps. Asked neutral questions earlier, recorded answers verbatim. He didn't accuse. Not yet. The next morning, he took Mara to a pediatric clinic across town. Not the family doctor. Someone with no history, no favors owed. The physician didn't hesitate. "These are non-accidental injuries," she said plainly. "Yeah, I'm required to report this." Daniel nodded. "So am I." Child services moved quickly. Law enforcement less so. Statements were taken. Names were written down. The accused was someone with weight in the city, a civic board member, a man whose photo appeared on charity flyers and gala programs. The initial response was polite disbelief. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Children sometimes exaggerate. He's done a lot of good for this community." Daniel had heard those lines before. He'd quoted them in other stories. He just never imagined they'd be aimed at his daughter. That night, he sat at his desk long after the city fell asleep. He opened a new file, not a police report, a timeline. He pulled public records, nonprofits, shell foundations, quiet settlements buried in civil court, complaints withdrawn, patterns that only appeared when you stopped looking at cases individually. It wasn't the first time. That was the part that made his blood go cold. Mara had not been the first child to flinch. By the time the sun rose, Daniel knew something else too. The law might move slowly, but the truth didn't need permission. And once it was published, there would be no unseeing it. Daniel had spent his career learning how institutions protected themselves. He'd reported on police unions that closed ranks, corporations that buried harm behind legal language, and public figures who wore charity work like armor. The playbook was familiar. Deny first, delay second, discredit last. What unsettled him was how quickly it started this time. The detective assigned to Mara's case was courteous, methodical, and careful with his words. Too careful. "We're still gathering information," he said during their second meeting. "These things take time." "Time does what?" Daniel asked. "Protects children or protects reputations?" The detective didn't answer that. At home, Daniel changed everything. Locks, routines, passwords. He installed cameras, not for drama, but for record. He documented every interaction, every call, every missed call. Journalism had taught him one thing above all else. Memory is fragile. Documentation is not. Mara stayed quiet, not withdrawn, just contained. She followed instructions, finished homework, ate when prompted. But Daniel noticed the way she hesitated before sitting, the way she checked his face before speaking as if calibrating whether it was safe. One night, as he was tucking her in, she asked, "Am I in trouble?" The question nearly broke him. "No," he said firmly. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do. But everyone keeps asking me the same things," she whispered. "What if I say something wrong?" Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. "There is no wrong when you tell the truth." She nodded, but fear doesn't evaporate just because it's contradicted. Meanwhile, the city rallied around the accused. An op-ed appeared praising his decades of service. A radio host questioned the timing of the allegation. A council member called it deeply unfortunate for all involved, which Daniel recognized as a phrase designed to blur victims into inconvenience. Daniel hadn't published anything yet. That restraint cost him. He was warned quietly by an editor he trusted. "Be careful, you're too close." He understood the concern. Objectivity mattered, distance mattered, but so did silence. Daniel filed public records requests under his own name, not the paper's. He traced nonprofits that shared board members. He pulled sealed civil cases that suddenly made sense when viewed together. Patterns emerged not as accusations but as repetition. Always a child, always a trusted figure, always a quiet resolution. He interviewed former staff, parents who would only speak off record, a woman who cried when she realized why Daniel was calling. "I thought it was just us," she said. "They made us feel crazy." Law enforcement stalled. The district attorney declined to file charges pending further review. Daniel recognized that phrase too. That was when he made the decision he'd been avoiding. If the system would not act on evidence alone, it would act on exposure. He pitched the story differently. Not an accusation, not a crusade. A pattern. Editors were hesitant at first, until they weren't. The legal team scrubbed every line. Every verb mattered. No assumptions, no speculation. Only records, testimony, and timelines that spoke for themselves. When the story ran, it didn't scream. It didn't need to. The headline was restrained. The facts were not. By morning, Daniel's phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Parents called. Former employees emailed. A nonprofit quietly removed a name from its website. A radio host walked back his comments without admitting error. The city shifted. Law enforcement reopened the file by the end of the week. Mara didn't know about the article yet. Daniel waited. He wanted her world as small and safe as possible for as long as possible. But children noticed change. "They're saying your name on the news," she said one evening. Daniel swallowed. "They're talking about the truth." She considered that. "Will they believe me now?" He looked at her. Really looked. They always should have. The investigation gained speed. Subpoenas followed. Old settlements resurfaced. The man who had once been untouchable stopped attending public events, but Daniel felt no relief yet. It's because exposure doesn't end a fight. It just makes it impossible to hide. And the closer the truth moved to daylight, the more resistance it would face. The backlash arrived quietly at first. Daniel noticed it in the pauses between calls, in the way sources suddenly asked for anonymity again, in the editor's careful tone when they discussed the follow-up piece. The story had cracked something open, but cracks don't always widen on their own. Sometimes they're filled, patched with influence, pressure, and patience. A restraining order request appeared in Daniel's inbox before noon one morning, filed by the accused's legal team, framed as protection against harassment. Daniel almost laughed. Instead, he forwarded it to his attorney and kept working. Mara stayed home from school that week. Officially, it was to give her space. Unofficially, it was because someone had posted her name in a comment thread before moderators caught it. Daniel shut that down immediately. He called the principal himself. No photos, no press, no exceptions. He wasn't just a journalist now. He was a firewall. Law enforcement moved again, this time with urgency that felt rehearsed. Detectives asked for additional interviews. The district attorney's office requested copies of Daniel's documentation. The same office that had hesitated was suddenly attentive. That shift worried him, because when institutions pivot quickly, it's usually because something else is about to surface. He found it buried in a civil archive late one night. A case dismissed years earlier. Different city, different family, same language, same settlement structure, same law firm. Daniel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. This wasn't negligence. It was design. He reached out to the former plaintiff through an intermediary. She agreed to talk, off record at first. Her voice shook as she spoke. "They told us we'd destroy our own child if we went public," she said. "They said no one would ever believe us." Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't guide. He let the silence do its work. When the follow-up story published, the tone changed. It wasn't just about one case anymore. It was about how power protected itself, about how warning signs were ignored because they were inconvenient, about how money didn't buy innocence, it bought time. Public pressure mounted. Sponsors withdrew. Boards resigned. The man at the center of it all stopped issuing statements. That silence mattered more than denial. The district attorney announced charges 3 days later. Daniel read the press release twice before it sank in. Mara was in the living room, coloring quietly. He knelt in front of her, careful with his words. "They're going to court," he said. "They're listening now." She studied his face. "Does that mean it's over?" He shook his head gently. "It means it's moving. Courtrooms are strange places. Formal, controlled, emotional in ways no one acknowledges out loud." Daniel sat behind Mara during her testimony, where she couldn't see him but could feel him there. He kept his breathing steady. She did too. She told the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. The defense tried to rattle her. She didn't break. The prosecutor let the facts breathe. When it ended, Mara walked straight to Daniel and took his hand. "I didn't mess up," she said. "No," he replied. "You were brave." The verdict didn't come immediately. Trials rarely end cleanly, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Conviction followed. Sentencing followed that. The city exhaled as if it had woken from a long, uneasy sleep. Daniel didn't write the final article himself. He edited it, carefully, because some truths are better delivered without your own name attached. Mara returned to school, slowly, with support, with boundaries. One afternoon as they walked home together, she asked, "Do you still write about bad people?" Daniel considered the question. "I write about systems," he said. "People come after." She nodded, satisfied. Justice hadn't come fast or clean, but it had come, and that mattered, because the story wasn't about a journalist anymore. It was about a child who was finally believed. The sentence was handed down on a gray morning that felt strangely ordinary. Daniel sat in the back of the courtroom, not because he wanted distance, but because he wanted perspective. He had learned that front-row emotions could blur judgment. He needed clarity, not catharsis. Mara wasn't there. That decision had been made together. The trial had taken enough from her. Justice did not require her presence for its final act. When the judge read the conviction and outlined the years that would follow, there was no gasp, no dramatic reaction, just a low murmur that rippled through the room, the sound of a city recalibrating its understanding of someone it had trusted. The man who had once been introduced at charity dinners as a pillar of the community stared straight ahead. Not defiant, not apologetic, simply diminished. Daniel felt no triumph. What he felt was quieter, heavier, relief. Outside the courthouse, microphones waited. Cameras hovered at a respectful distance. Daniel declined interviews. He had already said what needed to be said, and he had said it in print, where words could not be twisted mid-sentence. The follow-up stories weren't about him anymore. They were about reform, policy changes, oversight boards, new reporting requirements for nonprofits and youth programs, the kind of changes that never make headlines on their own, but quietly determine whether harm repeats itself. Daniel stayed involved, but not visibly. He advised. He reviewed drafts. He made introductions. He understood how stories moved institutions, and he was careful not to let his own become a distraction. At home, life began to settle into something resembling routine. Mara laughed more easily now. The stiffness in her shoulders faded. She stopped flinching when adults raised their voices on television. Small thing, big thing. Healing rarely announced itself. One evening, as Daniel was cooking dinner, Mara appeared in the doorway again. This time, she was holding a school permission slip. "There's a field trip," she said. "You have to sign it." He took the paper, smiled. "I can do that." She watched him for a moment, then asked, "Are we done talking about it?" Daniel paused. "About what?" "All of it," she said. "The bad part." He thought carefully before answering. "We don't have to talk about it all the time, but we can talk about it whenever you want." She nodded. "Okay." That answer seemed to satisfy her. Daniel returned to work full-time, but his focus had shifted. He still covered crime, still followed corruption, but he had become more deliberate about what he chased. Sensational stories no longer tempted him. Patterns did. Accountability did. His editor noticed the change. "You're different," she said during a late meeting. "Sharper." Daniel considered that. "I'm clearer." The newsroom buzzed with new energy as younger reporters pitched investigations inspired by his work. He encouraged them, warned them too. "Facts first," he told them. "Ego last." The city, for its part, tried to move on. Some people pretended nothing had happened. Others rewrote their own memories to soften their discomfort. Daniel expected that. Communities often protect themselves by forgetting. But forgetting wasn't the same as erasing. The record remained. The articles, the court documents, the policy changes, the quiet acknowledgments from people who had once stayed silent and now didn't. One afternoon, Daniel received an email from a woman in another state. "My daughter told me something last night. I didn't know what to do. Then I remembered your story." Daniel stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "You did the right thing by listening," he wrote. "Keep listening." He didn't tell Mara about the email. Not yet. She didn't need to carry that weight. But it stayed with him, a reminder that stories rarely end where they begin. Later that week, Daniel and Mara took a walk along the river trail. The air was cool. Leaves crunched underfoot. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary peace. "Do you still get scared?" Mara asked suddenly. Daniel didn't lie. "Sometimes." "Me too," she said. Then, after a beat, but not like before, they stopped at the railing and watched the water move steadily beneath them. Daniel realized something then. Justice hadn't come from one article, or one verdict, or one brave child standing in a courtroom. It had come from persistence, from refusing to look away, from choosing truth again and again, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was personal. The story that had begun in their home had traveled outward, touching systems and strangers and policies Daniel would never see. And while the worst part was over, the work it created was still unfolding, quietly, in places far beyond the city limits. That was the part no headline ever captured, and it was the part that mattered most. The first anniversary passed without ceremony. Daniel realized it only because the date caught his eye while he was flipping through his calendar, penciling in a routine meeting with an editor. He stared at the square for a moment, then closed the book and went to make breakfast. Mara was at the counter, hair half-tied, humming to herself as she poured cereal. Ordinary, unremarkable, perfect. She noticed him watching and raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," Daniel said. "Just thinking." They ate together, talking about a science project and whether frogs really could breathe through their skin. The conversation drifted the way healthy conversations do, unburdened by caution. That afternoon, Daniel published his last piece connected to the case. Not an expose, not an indictment, a reflection. It focused on what happens after the headlines fade, on how systems quietly resist change once public pressure eases, on how protection should not depend on outrage cycles. The article named no villains. It didn't need to. The facts were already part of the public record. It was shared widely, not virally, steadily. That suited him. Mara came home from school with a permission slip and a grin. "They want parents to volunteer for the overnight trip," she said. "You don't have to." Daniel smiled. "I want to." She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." That pause mattered. Consent mattered. Choice mattered. At the trip, Daniel watched from a respectful distance as Mara laughed with friends, her voice bright and unguarded. A year earlier, he hadn't been sure she would ever sound like that again. Healing, he learned, wasn't loud. It was cumulative. The man who had hurt her filed an appeal. It failed. Another followed. It failed too. The process dragged on the way such things always do, but it no longer felt like a threat. The verdict had shifted something permanent. Mara no longer asked if people believed her. She knew. Daniel kept writing. He trained younger reporters. He turned down television appearances. He focused on work that built rather than burned. Accountability over spectacle. Structure over scandal. One evening, as they cleaned up dinner together, Mara asked, "Do you ever wish you weren't a journalist?" Daniel rinsed a plate and thought about it. "No," he said, "but I wish the world didn't give me so many reasons to be one." She considered that. "I'm glad you are." Later, Daniel sat alone on the porch, the city humming softly beyond the trees. He thought about the moment everything had changed. A doorway, a lifted sleeve, a choice not to react but to listen. He had spent years believing his job was to reveal truth to strangers. He understood now that his most important work had been recognizing it at home. Justice hadn't arrived all at once. It had arrived in layers. Through law, through journalism, through public accountability, through the simple radical act of believing a child. Mara slept peacefully inside. No light left on anymore. No hesitation in her breathing. Daniel closed his laptop and let the quiet settle. Some stories end with noise. Trials, verdicts, applause. This one ended with something better. Normalcy. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.